On the 3rd of July 1940, British warships opened fire on the French fleet. Think about that for a moment. Just weeks earlier, these two nations had been fighting side by side against Nazi Germany. French and British soldiers had evacuated together from the beaches of Dunkirk. Their governments had even briefly discussed merging into a single nation to resist Hitler. And then, in a sun-scorched harbour on the Algerian coast, Britain turned its guns on its closest ally and killed nearly 1,300 French sailors in a matter of minutes. How does something like that happen? That question is at the heart of one of the most disturbing and morally complex decisions of the entire Second World War. Not a decision made in the fog of battle against an enemy, but a cold, calculated choice made by Winston Churchill and the British War Cabinet against men who, weeks before, had been comrades. The attack at Mers-el-Kébir wasn't an accident, wasn't a skirmish, and wasn't a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control. It was a deliberate military operation, planned and executed with grim purpose. But why? What could possibly justify opening fire on an Allied navy? The answer takes you into the most desperate summer Britain had faced in living memory. By July 1940, France had collapsed with stunning speed. Nazi Germany controlled most of Western Europe. Britain stood effectively alone, its army battered, its resources stretched, an invasion feeling less like a distant threat and more like a matter of when rather than if. In that context, the French fleet suddenly became one of the most consequential questions of the entire war. France possessed the fourth largest navy in the world. Powerful, modern warships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers that could dramatically shift the balance of naval power in either direction. If those ships fell under German or Italian control, Britain's ability to defend its coastline, protect its supply lines, and project any kind of power across the Atlantic could be fatally compromised. The stakes were nothing less than survival, and that is where this story gets genuinely complicated. Because the French hadn't handed their fleet to Germany. Their commanders had given assurances it would never fall into Axis hands. There were armistice terms, there were promises, there were negotiations happening even as British guns were being trained on French hulls. Some historians argue Churchill acted out of cold necessity in an impossible situation. Others argue he made a catastrophic moral error that poisoned Anglo-French relations for years, and may not have been strategically necessary at all. What makes Mers-el-Kébir so enduring as a historical controversy is that it sits at the collision point of so many enormous forces simultaneously: fear and calculation, trust and betrayal, military logic and human cost. It forces us to ask what leaders are permitted to do when they believe civilization itself is on the line, and whether good intentions or terrible outcomes matter more when we judge them. We're going to work through all of it: the collapse of France and what it meant for the balance of power, the character and thinking of Churchill himself, the specific details of what happened in that harbour and why negotiations failed, the reaction across the world, and finally, the question historians still argue over today: was this a necessary act of war, a tragic mistake, or somehow, uncomfortably, both at once? To understand why Britain did what it did at Mers-el-Kébir, you have to feel the weight of what those weeks in the summer of 1940 actually meant. Not as a historical fact you can summarize in a sentence, but as a lived experience of accelerating disaster, because for the people inside it, the speed of events felt almost physically disorienting. In May 1940, Germany launched its offensive in the west. Within 6 weeks, it was over. France, a nation with one of the largest armies in the world, a country that had held the Western Front for 4 grinding years in the previous war, had been broken completely. The armistice was signed on June 22nd. Paris had fallen. The French government had fled. And with France gone, Britain found itself in a position that had no modern precedent. It was not simply outnumbered or outgunned. It was alone in a way that had seemed almost inconceivable even months before. The geography of that isolation mattered enormously. Scan a map of Europe in July 1940, and what you see is a continent almost entirely under German influence or control. Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, all gone. Spain, under Franco, technically neutral, but clearly sympathetic to the Axis. Italy had entered the war on Germany's side in June, opening a second front in the Mediterranean. The Soviet Union was still bound to Germany through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The United States was distant, sympathetic in certain quarters, but politically constrained by powerful isolationist sentiment and a long way from any commitment to enter the war. Britain's traditional strategy of building coalitions, of leveraging continental allies to avoid bearing the full weight of a European land war, had simply collapsed. What remained? The English Channel, 21 miles at its narrowest point, and the Royal Navy. Inside the War Cabinet, and at the highest levels of British military planning, the conversations happening in this period had a quality of barely controlled panic underneath their formal language. The chiefs of staff had produced assessments that were genuinely bleak. If Germany could establish air superiority over southern England, which the Luftwaffe was preparing to attempt, an invasion became feasible. Operation Sea Lion, as the Germans called their invasion plan, was being actively developed across the Channel. Britain's army had been rescued from Dunkirk, but it had left most of its equipment on the beaches of France. Tanks, artillery, vehicles, all abandoned. The army existed, but it would take time, perhaps a great deal of time, to refit and re-equip it into something capable of serious resistance to a German landing. The fear wasn't only invasion, though that was the most visceral concern. There was also the question of blockade. Britain imported enormous quantities of food and raw materials by sea. Cut those supply lines, and the country could be starved into submission without a single German soldier setting foot on British soil. The Atlantic routes were already under pressure from German U-boats. The Battle of the Atlantic, which would become one of the longest and most costly campaigns of the entire war, was already beginning. Britain's survival was therefore inseparable from its ability to keep the sea lanes open, and that meant naval power was not simply one strategic consideration among many. It was the foundation on which everything else rested. This is the context in which every decision Churchill and the War Cabinet made during this period has to be understood. And Churchill himself, whatever judgments historians apply to his specific choices, grasped this with complete clarity. He had spent decades thinking about naval power. He had served as First Lord of the Admiralty in the First World War. He understood instinctively that for an island nation, control of the surrounding waters was not a strategic preference but an existential requirement. Which brings us to why the French fleet produced something close to strategic terror in London. France possessed, in the summer of 1940, the fourth most powerful navy in the world. At its heart were modern, capable capital ships, the battle cruisers Dunkirk and Strasbourg, the older but still formidable battleships Bretagne and Provence, and the brand-new Richelieu and Jean Bart, among the most powerful warships of their era, not yet fully completed, but operational enough to matter. There were also cruisers, destroyers, submarines, a substantial fighting force scattered across various ports and anchorages, from metropolitan France to North Africa and beyond. Now consider the calculation British planners were forced to make. The armistice agreement between France and Germany contained provisions requiring France to demobilize most of its fleet, with ships nominally to remain under French control under German and Italian supervision. The French naval leadership, particularly Admiral François Darlan, had privately indicated that the fleet would never be surrendered to the Germans, that commanders had orders to scuttle rather than allow capture. But these were assurances, not guarantees. They were promises made in a rapidly shifting political landscape by men whose government had just collapsed under enemy pressure. What if those assurances were wrong? What if German pressure on the new Vichy government eventually proved irresistible? What if a political accommodation was reached that brought even a portion of the French fleet under Axis control, or simply available for Axis use? The addition of French capital ships to the German and Italian navies, even informally, could shift the balance of naval power in ways that threatened Britain's control of the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and potentially even the approaches to the home islands. It didn't require certainty for the prospect to feel intolerable. The mere possibility, in Britain's current position of naked vulnerability, carried strategic weight that felt catastrophic. The logic was brutal, but not irrational. Britain had no margin for error. It had no allies capable of compensating for losses. Every calculation had to account for worst-case scenarios, because in a world where France had fallen in 6 weeks, worst-case scenarios had a way of happening. The summer of 1940 was not a moment for measured trust in diplomatic assurances. It was a moment where survival felt contingent on eliminating uncertainties before they could become catastrophes. That is the atmosphere in which Churchill and his cabinet turned their attention to the French fleet, not as a question of international law or Allied loyalty, but as a question of whether Britain would still exist in 6 months' time. Everything that followed grew from that terrifying calculation. The French collapse didn't happen in a vacuum. To understand why the armistice terms alarmed Britain so profoundly, and why the status of the French fleet became so dangerously ambiguous, you have to follow what actually happened inside France during those catastrophic weeks. Because the political disintegration that accompanied the military defeat was, in some ways, even more consequential than the battlefield losses themselves. France entered the war in September 1939 with its political foundations already under considerable strain. The Third Republic was a system held together by compromise, coalition, and a constitutional structure that had always made decisive action difficult. A decade of economic depression, political polarization, and bitter ideological conflict between left and right had left French society deeply fractured. When the German offensive broke through at Sedan in May 1940, and the speed of the collapse became apparent, the political fractures didn't hold under pressure. They widened catastrophically. Within the government, 2 factions emerged almost immediately. One, associated with figures like Paul Reynaud, believed France should fight on regardless, if necessary from North Africa, where substantial French forces, resources and territory remained. The other faction, led increasingly by the aged Marshal Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun and arguably the most revered figure in French public life, believed that an armistice was not surrender but realism, a necessary act to preserve what remained of the French state and spare the civilian population further destruction. Pétain won the argument. Reynaud resigned, and on June 22, 1940, France signed an armistice with Germany in the same railway car at Compiègne where Germany had signed its own armistice in 1918, a piece of stagecraft by Hitler that underlined exactly how complete the reversal of fortune had been. The armistice terms were constructed in a way that looked on paper almost deliberately designed to appear tolerable, while concealing enormous dangers. Germany would occupy the northern and western portions of France, including Paris and the entire Atlantic coastline. A nominally independent French state would govern the remaining southern zone. With its capital established at the spa town of Vichy, the French army would be drastically reduced, and crucially the French fleet would be demobilized, with ships concentrated in their home ports and placed under German and Italian supervision, though the armistice text specified they would not be used by the Axis powers themselves. That final provision was the sentence that haunted British planners. It was, in their view, a clause written to be broken. Germany and Italy would have French warships sitting in ports, immobilized under their supervision. The distance between supervised immobilization and operational use was exactly as far as Hitler decided it needed to be. And the track record of German assurances in 1940 after Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium was not one that invited confidence in formal commitments. But the armistice text was only part of the problem. The deeper uncertainty centered on the nature of the Vichy regime itself. Was it a genuinely independent government, capable of honoring and enforcing the terms it agreed to? Or was it, as many in London increasingly suspected, a facade, a French face placed on an essentially German-directed occupation? That question had no clean answer in the summer of 1940, and it may not have had a clean answer because the situation itself was genuinely ambiguous, even to many of the French officials operating within it. Pétain and his government believed, or at least told themselves they believed, that they were preserving French sovereignty through accommodation, buying time, maintaining administrative control, protecting French civilians from the harsher occupation that might have followed complete collapse. Some historians have taken this argument at least partially seriously. Others regard Vichy as a regime that embraced collaboration with considerable enthusiasm and used the convenient fiction of independence to pursue its own reactionary agenda under German cover. What is certain is that from London's perspective in the summer of 1940, the answers to these questions were entirely unclear, and the intelligence available to British decision-makers was fragmentary, contradictory, and often simply wrong. The rumour mill during this period was extraordinary. Information flowing out of France was distorted by the chaos of defeat, the disruption of communications, and the competing interests of various French factions, some of whom had very strong reasons to shade their reporting. London received alarming signals suggesting German pressure on Vichy was intense and immediate. It received contradictory assurances from French naval officers that the fleet would never be surrendered. It heard rumours about secret protocols attached to the armistice, additional terms beyond those publicly announced, that might commit France to far greater cooperation with Germany than the visible text suggested. Some of these rumours were unfounded, but some were not entirely wrong in their general direction, and British intelligence struggled to distinguish between them with any confidence. Admiral François Darlan, who controlled the French navy, and whose personal word was the primary guarantee that the fleet would not fall into German hands, was himself a figure who defied easy interpretation. He was a committed French nationalist, deeply proud of the navy he had built. He had given private assurances to British contacts that he would never allow his ships to serve the Axis. He would, later, infamously prove himself willing to collaborate with the Germans to a degree that suggested those assurances were worth considerably less than he claimed. In the summer of 1940, however, none of that future behaviour was visible. What was visible was a man whose personal honour was invoked as the primary safeguard of one of the most strategically significant naval forces in the world, and for Britain's war cabinet, personal honour, however genuine, was not a sufficient substitute for physical certainty. This is the gap that defined the crisis, the distance between what the armistice said on paper, what French officers promised in private conversations, and what the British government felt it could actually rely upon when its survival was at stake. Legal guarantees existed in a world of normal peacetime relationships between states with functioning institutions and stable governments. The Vichy regime was none of those things. It was a new entity of unknown loyalties constrained by occupying powers, operating in conditions of defeat and humiliation, and subject to pressures that no one in London could fully observe or measure. The French defeat had not simply removed an ally. It had created something far more dangerous and far more difficult to manage, a former ally whose assets remained significant, whose intentions remained uncertain, and whose ability to control its own future remained deeply in doubt. That uncertainty was the Vichy problem. And it was, for Churchill and his cabinet, an uncertainty they decided they could not afford to leave unresolved. So when we talk about the French fleet as a strategic asset, we need to be precise about what was actually at stake, because this was not a symbolic concern, and it was not a marginal one. The French Navy in 1940 was among the most capable and modern naval forces in the world, and its potential transfer to hostile control represented something close to a worst-case scenario for British planners trying to hold the line alone. At the time of the armistice, France possessed the fourth largest navy on the planet. It wasn't simply large in tonnage terms, it was genuinely modern. During the 1930s, France had invested heavily in a naval construction program designed primarily to counter Italian naval expansion in the Mediterranean, and the results were impressive. The Dunkirk and Strasbourg were fast battleships, sleek and purpose-built, capable of speeds that made them dangerous against almost anything afloat. The Richelieu and June Bart, even more powerful, were either completed or near completion, formidable capital ships that represented the cutting edge of French naval engineering. Beyond these headline vessels, the French Navy included heavy and light cruisers, a substantial destroyer force, and one of the largest submarine fleets in the world. This was not a collection of aging hulls left over from the last war. It was a fighting force built for contemporary warfare. The strategic geography of where this fleet was actually positioned made the situation considerably more alarming. French naval power was distributed across a network of bases that, taken together, formed a kind of maritime geography of empire. Toulon on the Mediterranean coast was the heart of the French fleet's infrastructure, but Mers-el-Kébir, the large and well-equipped harbour near Oran on the Algerian coast, held a substantial portion of the most powerful ships. Dakar in West Africa positioned French naval power along the South Atlantic approaches. Alexandria in Egypt hosted additional vessels under a fragile joint arrangement with the Royal Navy. This wasn't a fleet sitting in one vulnerable location. It was dispersed across a strategic arc stretching from northwestern Europe to the South Atlantic to the eastern Mediterranean. For Britain, this geographic distribution cut both ways. It meant that any British action to secure or neutralise the fleet would have to be coordinated across multiple theatres simultaneously, against forces that were not always accessible or vulnerable. But it also meant that if the Axis were to gain even partial use of these vessels and bases, the strategic consequences would cascade across virtually every theatre where Britain still had interests. Consider what control of French North African naval bases would mean in practical terms. The Mediterranean had already become enormously difficult for Britain. Italy's entry into the war in June 1940 had transformed the sea from a British thoroughfare to a contested battleground. The route through the Mediterranean to Egypt, to the Suez Canal, to India, and the oil of the Middle East was already threatened. If the Axis could add French Atlantic coast harbours and North African bases to their operational network, Britain's ability to supply Malta, reinforce Egypt, and maintain any meaningful Mediterranean presence would be placed under pressure that might simply become insurmountable. The Atlantic dimension was, if anything, even more immediately threatening. Germany's submarine campaign against British shipping was already underway in the summer of 1940, and the Battle of the Atlantic would soon become one of the most existential struggles of the entire war. Britain depended on Atlantic supply lines for food, fuel, and military equipment, including, increasingly, materials flowing from a United States that had not yet entered the conflict. French Atlantic ports like Brest and Lorient had already fallen under German control as part of the armistice terms, which was alarming enough on its own. The prospect of French warships, particularly the modern capital ships and the large submarine fleet, operating from those ports in support of German operations against Atlantic convoys, was not a theoretical concern. It was an operational nightmare that British naval planners had to model as a genuine possibility. And here lies the specific danger that made even partial Axis use of the French fleet so terrifying. You did not need the entire French Navy to swing under Axis control to fundamentally alter the balance of power at sea. Even a portion of it, a few capital ships joining the German and Italian battle lines, a significant number of submarines added to the U-boat campaign, French naval bases providing additional infrastructure for Axis operations, could tip maritime balances that Britain was already struggling to maintain. The Royal Navy in 1940 was stretched to a degree that has sometimes been underappreciated. It was fighting simultaneously to defend home waters against a possible invasion, maintain the North Sea blockade of Germany, police the Mediterranean, and protect Atlantic supply lines. Adding French naval strength to the other side of that equation was not merely bad, it might be catastrophic. There was also the question of what the Axis had conspicuously lacked throughout the war to that point, a genuine capacity to challenge British naval supremacy directly. Germany's surface fleet, while dangerous in specific contexts, was never large enough to confront the Royal Navy in open battle. Italy's navy, though significant in the Mediterranean, had its own limitations, but a combined Axis fleet that incorporated even the most powerful French units would begin to look like something qualitatively different, a force that might genuinely contest control of the Atlantic or the Western Mediterranean in ways that individual Axis navies could not achieve alone. It's worth being careful here about what the evidence actually supports. We cannot know with certainty that Germany would have found ways to pressure Vichy into operational use of the fleet, nor that Darlan and his officers would ultimately have complied. What we can say is that the scenario was plausible enough that British strategists could not dismiss it, and that the consequences of being wrong about French intentions even once could be irreversible. Warships sunk could not be unsunk. Strategic balances shifted by naval power took years to correct. The French fleet was not, in other words, an abstraction or a matter of prestige. It was a collection of very real, very modern, very capable instruments of war, positioned at geographic points that happened to correspond almost perfectly with Britain's most critical vulnerabilities. The uncertainty about where those instruments might ultimately point was not a diplomatic inconvenience. It was, from London's perspective, a loaded question that the summer of 1940 was forcing them to answer before someone else answered it for them. Understanding why Britain ultimately acted on that loaded question requires understanding the man who drove the decision, and Winston Churchill, in the summer of 1940, was not a figure shaped only by the immediate crisis. He was the product of decades of strategic thinking, personal experience across multiple wars, and a historical imagination that was simultaneously his greatest asset, and, some historians would argue, an occasional liability. Churchill had been present at, or closely connected to, some of the defining naval and military episodes of the previous 40 years. He had served as First Lord of the Admiralty during the First World War. He had lived through the consequences of strategic miscalculation at Gallipoli, through the humiliation of watching carefully laid plans collapse against the friction of reality, through the experience of seeing allies behave unpredictably under pressure. By 1940 he was not a man operating on hope or on the assumption that reasonable actors would make reasonable choices at critical moments. He was a man who had watched reasonable actors make catastrophically unreasonable choices, and who had revised his assumptions accordingly. This biographical context matters because Churchill's approach to the French fleet question was not primarily driven by evidence of French bad faith. Darlan had given assurances. The armistice terms on paper prevented German use of French warships. Individual French naval officers were making pledges that, from a strictly legal standpoint, seemed to address British concerns. A different kind of leader, weighing probabilities on a calm balance sheet, might have accepted those assurances and waited to see how circumstances developed. Churchill's mind did not work that way in the summer of 1940, and there are reasons to think that was not simple stubbornness. His strategic worldview was organised around worst-case planning in a way that the events of the previous year had thoroughly vindicated. The comfortable assumptions about Hitler's intentions that had guided British policy through the 1930s had proven catastrophically wrong. The confidence that France would hold that the Maginot Line, the Allied armies, the sheer weight of Franco-British combined power would stabilise the front, had dissolved within 6 weeks. Churchill had spent much of the 1930s warning that optimistic assessments were being substituted for rigorous ones, and he had been right often enough that by June 1940 his instinct toward worst-case analysis carried genuine intellectual authority, at least in his own estimation. His view of the French fleet, then, was shaped by a fundamental question: not what was most likely to happen, but what would happen to Britain if the worst-case scenario occurred and Britain had done nothing to prevent it. He could imagine, with great clarity, a version of 1941 in which German pressure on Vichy had gradually tightened, in which French officers who had promised neutrality found themselves facing impossible choices, and in which the powerful ships he knew sat in North African harbours had somehow become instruments pointed against British interests. Once those ships were gone, once they had been absorbed into or placed at the disposal of Axis operations, there was no recovering the position. The decision had to be made before that possibility materialized, not after. There is a separate and important question about whether Churchill viewed the French fleet primarily as a military threat, as a political test, or as something that served both functions simultaneously. The honest answer seems to be both, and consciously so. He understood that the military stakes were real, as we have already examined. But he also understood, with the instincts of a man who had spent his career thinking about grand strategy as a combination of military capacity and political communication, that how Britain handled this moment would send signals that travelled far beyond the harbours of North Africa. Britain in the summer of 1940 was trying to accomplish something extraordinarily difficult, convincing the world, and specifically convincing the United States, that it was not finished, that it intended to fight on, that investing in British survival was not throwing money into a losing cause. The fall of France had shaken that confidence severely. American opinion, though increasingly sympathetic to Britain, was not certain. Roosevelt's ability to provide meaningful support depended in part on the political argument that Britain could actually use that support to survive and fight effectively. A Britain that hesitated, that allowed sentiment and diplomatic courtesy to prevent it from taking brutal necessary action, was not the Britain that could make that argument convincingly. Churchill's famous phrases about fighting on regardless, on the beaches, in the fields, in the streets, were not simply rhetoric for domestic audiences. They were strategic communications aimed at shaping international perceptions of British resolve, and resolve to mean anything had to be demonstrated through action, not just words. The handling of the French fleet offered an opportunity, a terrible, painful opportunity, to make that demonstration in a way that could not be misread by anyone paying attention. There was something almost coldly analytical beneath the emotional and rhetorical surface of Churchill's approach to this moment. He recognized that Britain's survival in the short term depended not only on its military capacity, but on its perceived willingness to use that capacity without flinching, even against former allies, even at significant moral and diplomatic cost. A nation that could do that could absorb the reputational damage and the human anguish and press forward regardless, was a nation that might actually be worth backing. A nation that could not was a nation that enemies might calculate was already broken. Whether this calculus was correct is a genuinely contested historical question, and we will return to it. What matters here is understanding that Churchill was not making a straightforward military decision when he pressed toward action against the French fleet. He was making a statement about what kind of power Britain intended to be, and what lengths it was prepared to go to in order to survive. The fleet was simultaneously a real threat that needed addressing and a vehicle through which Britain would demonstrate to the world, and perhaps to itself, that the war was not over, that the country at the edge of the abyss was still capable of ruthless, deliberate action. That combination of genuine strategic fear, worst-case historical memory, and cold-eyed calculation about international perception set the stage for what was about to unfold, a military operation that had been quietly taking shape even as diplomats were still talking. That military operation had a name, Operation Catapult, and understanding it properly means resisting the temptation to see Mers-el-Kébir as an isolated act of violence, a single terrible decision made in a single terrible moment. What actually unfolded on and around the 3rd of July 1940 was a coordinated, carefully planned effort to deal with the entire question of French naval power in one decisive stroke. Mers-el-Kébir was the most dramatic and the most catastrophic piece of that plan, but it was a piece of something larger, not the whole picture. Operation Catapult was conceived as a solution to the problem that Churchill and the War Cabinet had been wrestling with since the French armistice. The goal, put simply, was to ensure that French warships would not fall under German or Italian control, either by bringing those ships under British command, by putting them beyond operational use, or, if necessary, by destroying them. The operation was designed to be executed simultaneously across multiple locations. precisely because the British feared that any delay or partial action would give the French time to respond, to disperse their ships, or to allow word to reach Axis ears before the moment of maximum British leverage had passed. Coordination and surprise were built into the plan from the beginning. The parts of Operation Catapult that history tends to overlook are the actions taken in British-controlled ports. On the morning of July 3rd, the Royal Navy moved against French vessels that had sailed to or remained in British harbours after the armistice, ships anchored at Portsmouth, Plymouth and Sheerness, as well as elsewhere across British-controlled waters. The French crews aboard these ships woke to find themselves surrounded, their vessels boarded by British sailors and marines, and their command over their own ships effectively ended. It was a seizure, conducted with the full weight of British naval authority, and it covered a significant number of vessels, destroyers, submarines, smaller craft, and support ships whose combined value was not negligible. What is striking about these seizures in British ports is how relatively, and the word relatively is doing genuine work here, how relatively peacefully they were carried out. There were confrontations, there was anger, bewilderment, and in several cases active resistance. French sailors who had considered themselves allies, who had in some cases fought alongside British forces only weeks earlier, found themselves effectively prisoners on their own ships. The psychological shock was real, and the indignation was entirely understandable. But the number of casualties from these British port seizures was, compared to what was about to happen in North Africa, minimal. The circumstances were different. French ships in British harbours were already effectively surrounded, already operating within a context where British control of the surrounding environment was absolute. The calculus of resistance was stark and obvious, and while French honour was wounded, French blood was largely not shed. One French submarine, the Surcouf, one of the largest submarines in the world at that point, provided a more violent exception. During its boarding at Plymouth, a firefight broke out in which British officers and French sailors were killed. It was a grim preview of the frictions that the operation would generate even in its most controlled settings. But even that incident, with its real human cost, took place within an environment where British operational control was never genuinely in doubt. The seizure happened. The French did not get their submarine back. The situation in North Africa was entirely different, and the planners of Operation Catapult understood that from the start. This is where the operation's internal tensions become visible. In British ports, geography and proximity ensured British leverage. At Alexandria, where a separate French squadron sat under the guns of a British fleet commanded by Admiral Cunningham, intensive personal negotiations between the two fleet commanders eventually produced a peaceful resolution. The French ships were immobilized without bloodshed through a process that required patience, trust, and a degree of mutual respect between the commanders involved. Cunningham himself was deeply uncomfortable with the idea of opening fire on former allies, and worked strenuously to find an alternative. He found one. That outcome demonstrated that peaceful solutions were possible when local conditions and personal relationships allowed the space for them. Mers-el-Kébir, on the other hand, was a different environment entirely. The French fleet there was large, powerful, and concentrated. The harbour geography created complications that made clean, simple seizure impossible. The French commanders present were proud. Their loyalty to French sovereignty was fierce, and the chain of command running back to Vichy created a set of constraints on their freedom to act that were very different from the situation facing individual captains in British ports. And crucially, as we will examine, the British officer sent to deliver the ultimatum and the French admiral charged with responding to it were personalities whose particular temperaments, loyalties, and reading of the situation made compromise extraordinarily difficult to achieve. This unevenness across different theatres is actually one of the most revealing things about Operation Catapult. It shows that there was no single, inevitable outcome baked into the British decision to act. The operation was a policy framework applied across varied and uncontrollable local conditions, where those conditions allowed for relatively peaceful resolution as at Alexandria, the framework bent toward accommodation. Where conditions made accommodation almost structurally impossible, as at Mers-el-Kébir, the operation's harder edges came forward. The violence that followed was not purely a product of the policy itself, but of the collision between that policy and a specific set of circumstances that offered very little room for the kind of flexibility that Cunningham had found at Alexandria. What Operation Catapult reveals, then, is both the urgency driving British decision-making and the limits of what top-down planning could actually control once it met reality on the ground. Churchill and the War Cabinet had made a strategic choice. They had decided that the risk of inaction outweighed the cost of action, whatever that cost proved to be. But the shape that cost would take, how much blood, how much diplomatic damage, how much lasting bitterness, was not something London could fully determine from the map room, but would be settled in a specific harbour on a specific afternoon by specific men facing one another across an ultimatum that was running out of time. That harbour was Mers-el-Kébir, carved into the northwestern coast of Algeria a few miles west of the port city of Oran, and on the morning of July 3rd, 1940, it held one of the most powerful concentrations of French naval force anywhere in the world. The French squadron anchored there, designated Force de Raid, was not a token presence. At its core were two of France's most modern and capable capital ships, the battle cruisers Dunkirk and Strasbourg, vessels that had been specifically designed to counter the threat posed by German pocket battleships in the 1930s. Fast, well-armed, and relatively new, they represented the cutting edge of French naval construction. Alongside them sat two older battleships, the Bretagne and the Provence, whose age did not diminish their firepower. There were also destroyers, a seaplane tender, and various supporting vessels clustered in the harbour. Taken together, this was a squadron capable of meaningfully altering the naval balance in the Atlantic or the Mediterranean if it were ever placed under Axis direction. That prospect was precisely what kept Churchill and the Admiralty awake at night, and it was precisely why Mers-el-Kébir, and not some secondary anchorage, was the gravitational centre of Operation Catapult. The harbour itself deserves attention, because its physical character shaped everything that followed. Mers-el-Kébir sits in a deep natural bay, sheltered by a long breakwater and backed by rising ground that dominates the approaches from the sea. It was designed and used as a military anchorage rather than a commercial port, which meant that its geography favoured the defenders and complicated any outside attempt at coercion or seizure. The entrance to the harbour was narrow relative to the size of the vessels inside, which meant that any attempt to move ships quickly, either to escape or to reconfigure, was inherently constrained. The French ships, once inside, were not easily repositioned. That same geography also meant that the British Force H, operating from its position outside the harbour, could not simply steam in and surround the French vessels the way Royal Navy crews had surrounded their targets in Portsmouth or Plymouth. The harbour was a trap for whoever was caught inside it, but it was also a fortified position that made any outside attacker's task genuinely difficult. Into this situation the British sent Vice Admiral James Somerville, commanding Force H from his flagship HMS Hood. Somerville was an experienced and capable officer, well regarded within the Royal Navy, and his selection to lead this operation reflected genuine institutional confidence in his abilities. But what is striking about Somerville in the days surrounding Mers-el-Kébir is how deeply uncomfortable he was with the mission he had been handed. He had actually signalled the Admiralty before the operation to argue, respectfully but clearly, that he believed an attack on the French fleet was unnecessary, that negotiation could succeed, that the French commanders were men of honour, and that firing on former allies would be a political and moral catastrophe whose costs would outweigh its strategic benefits. His superiors disagreed, or rather they acknowledged his concerns and ordered him to proceed anyway. Somerville, like the professional officer he was, obeyed. But understanding his reluctance matters enormously for reading what happened in the negotiations that followed. He was not a man looking for an excuse to open fire. If anything, he was a man hoping, perhaps more than the situation warranted, that the French would find a way to give him a reason not to. The French officer on the other side of that equation was Vice Admiral Marcel Bruno Gensol, and the contrast in temperament and approach between the two men is one of the factors historians have returned to repeatedly when trying to understand why the day ended the way it did. Gensol was a proud, senior and somewhat formal figure who commanded his squadron with an acute awareness of naval honour and proper military protocol. He was not an unreasonable man, but he was a man for whom dignity, hierarchy, and the formal channels of authority carried genuine weight. When the British initially sent not Somerville himself but a junior officer, a lieutenant commander named Cedric Holland, to deliver the ultimatum, Gensol's first instinct was offence. He was a vice admiral. He expected to deal with a peer, not a subordinate. That response was not petty vanity. It was a product of how naval culture understood negotiation and respect. But it meant that the opening hours of contact between the two sides were filtered through a layer of procedural friction that ate away at the available time. The communication problems went deeper than rank and protocol. Gensol was not fully transparent in his initial reporting back to French naval headquarters about the terms Britain had actually offered. There is evidence, and historians differ on how charitably to read it, that his summary of the British ultimatum was incomplete in ways that reduced the apparent room for manoeuvre his superiors might have allowed him, had they understood the full picture. Whether this reflected a deliberate framing, a man under pressure summarizing imperfectly, or something in between is genuinely difficult to say from the historical record. But the effect was to narrow the diplomatic space at exactly the moment when every degree of flexibility might have mattered. The military imbalance between the two forces added its own pressure to everything. On paper, Force H carried significant firepower, Hood, 2 other capital ships, an aircraft carrier, and screening destroyers. But the French ships inside the harbour were not helpless targets. Their guns could respond, the harbour's geography complicated British firing angles, and French shore batteries added a defensive layer that made any attack a genuine engagement rather than a simple execution. Somerville knew that opening fire was not a cost-free action. He would take losses. His ships would be damaged. The operation could go wrong in multiple directions simultaneously. This is not a detail that softens the story. The disparity in ultimate outcomes was real and brutal, but it does help explain why, even from the British side, the events of that afternoon felt like a threshold that both commanders crossed with dread rather than confidence. 2 men, 1 enclosed harbour, 1 immovable ultimatum, and a history that had just rendered their previous alliance into a complication, neither was equipped to navigate cleanly. The collision that was coming was not inevitable in the abstract. But by the time the morning of July 3rd had fully opened, it was beginning to feel very much like it was. The document that Lieutenant Commander Cedric Holland carried into Mers-el-Kébir on the morning of July 3rd was not a casual communication. It had been drafted at the highest levels of British government and military planning, reviewed by Churchill personally, and shaped by weeks of anxious deliberation about what France's collapse meant for the naval balance of power. It was, in the truest sense, a document that Britain had thought hard about, and yet, as it played out on the ground, it revealed how much thinking hard about a problem from one perspective can still leave you blindsided by how it reads from another. The ultimatum presented to Gensol offered 4 options, each framed as a genuine alternative rather than a prelude to a single predetermined outcome. At least that was how Britain understood it. The first option was the most straightforward from Britain's point of view. The French fleet at Mers-el-Kébir could join the Royal Navy and continue fighting against Germany and Italy. The ships would sail under the British flag or in coordination with British forces, and their crews would be given the choice of continuing to serve or being repatriated. From London's perspective, this was the obvious solution. France and Britain had been allies. The cause was the same. The enemy hadn't changed. Why not simply continue? The second option was more accommodating to French political sensitivities, or so the British believed. If joining the British fight directly was unacceptable, the French ships could sail to a British port where they would be placed in safekeeping for the duration of the war. This preserved the vessels and the crews without requiring the French to formally switch allegiances. It acknowledged the awkward reality that the armistice had placed French officers in an impossible position regarding formal chain of command, but it offered a way out that didn't require anyone to explicitly renounce anything. The third option was the one that suggested Britain had at least attempted to think about French domestic political constraints. The French squadron could sail to a French port in the Caribbean, Martinique was specifically named, or to the United States, where the ships would be demilitarized or placed under American custody for the duration of the war. This option was designed to sidestep the most painful elements of the first two. It didn't require fighting against Germany, it didn't require surrendering to Britain, and it kept the ships out of Axis hands. In theory, it offered the kind of neutral resolution that a diplomatically imaginative mind might have built something around. The fourth option, and the one that defined the ultimatum's true nature, was the ultimatum itself. If none of the first three choices were accepted within a defined window of time, the British fleet outside the harbour would open fire and destroy the French ships at anchor. From Britain's perspective, each of the first three options was serious. Each was workable, and together they represented genuine flexibility. Churchill and the Admiralty believed they had gone out of their way to avoid the fourth outcome. They had offered multiple exits, any one of which would have resolved the crisis without bloodshed. If the French refused all of them, Britain could tell itself, and the world, that it had tried every reasonable avenue. From the French side, the options looked entirely different. The first two required French officers to effectively defect, to place their ships under British command or custody in direct violation of the armistice terms. The armistice had been an act of state, ratified by a government that France still, however ambiguously, recognised as legitimate. For Gensol and officers of his generation and rank, disobeying their government's formal treaty obligations was not merely inconvenient. It was a breach of military honour, so fundamental that entertaining it seriously felt like dissolving the very identity they had spent their careers constructing. There was also a practical fear. France had received assurances from Germany, however fragile, that the fleet would not be seized as long as it remained under French control and in French waters. Sailing to Britain would potentially destroy those assurances and expose French territories and civilians to immediate German retaliation. The Caribbean option, the one that seemed most designed for a face-saving exit, ran into its own problems. Sailing to Martinique or seeking American custody meant removing French warships from any influence over the Mediterranean situation at precisely the moment when the Vichy government was attempting to use its military assets as bargaining chips in whatever relationship it was trying to negotiate with Germany. Voluntarily neutralising the fleet felt, to many French naval officers, like surrendering the only leverage France had left. There was also a deep structural misunderstanding embedded in the ultimatum's logic. Britain presented the options as equally viable, but Gensol and the French naval establishment received them as a binary: either comply with terms that violated the armistice and dishonoured their service, or face destruction. The third option, which in theory offered a neutral path, was never seriously engaged with on the French side, in part because it arrived inside a document whose tone and framing communicated accurately that Britain was fully prepared to use force. When the end of a letter says, "We will shoot you if you refuse," the diplomatic nuances in the middle tend to lose their texture. Whether Britain genuinely left room for a face-saving solution, or whether the ultimatum was structured in a way that made French refusal nearly inevitable, is one of the more genuinely contested questions in the historiography of the event. Some historians argue that the Caribbean option, in particular, represented a real opportunity that Gensol and the French Admiralty failed to fully explore, either through pride, poor communication upward, or a reading of the political situation in Vichy that made accommodation impossible regardless. Others contend that the tone and time pressure of the ultimatum made it functionally impossible to work through the diplomatic channels that might have found a resolution that the British, whatever their stated intentions, were operating on a timeline that almost guaranteed failure. What seems reasonably clear is that the gap between how Britain constructed the ultimatum and how France received it was not simply a product of bad faith on either side. It was a product of two parties operating from such fundamentally different situations, one fighting for survival with no room for ambiguity, the other trying to manage a humiliating defeat under occupation threat, that the same document genuinely meant different things depending on which side of the harbour entrance you were standing on. That gap did not close in the hours that followed. It widened. That widening gap had to be navigated in real time, under the summer heat of a North African harbour, by men operating with incomplete information, bureaucratic constraints, and personal pride that neither side was willing to fully set aside. What followed the delivery of the ultimatum was not a clean confrontation between two positions. It was something messier, more human, and in many ways more tragic. A series of hours during which the violence that came after might plausibly have been avoided, and yet through a combination of failures, large and small, was not. Admiral Gensoll's first response to the ultimatum was not to engage with its terms. It was to refuse to receive Holland at all. This was not simply stubbornness, though stubbornness certainly played a role. It was also a matter of rank and protocol. Holland held the title of captain. Gensoll commanded a major fleet. For Gensoll to sit across a table from a figure of significantly lower status and negotiate under the threat of British guns felt, within the framework of naval hierarchy that governed his entire professional identity, deeply inappropriate. It communicated something about how seriously Britain regarded the French position, or rather, how little it did. Whatever the intention behind sending Holland specifically, the choice of an officer of that rank almost certainly made the first hours of negotiation harder. It gave Gensoll a reason, however technical, to keep the conversation at arm's length. When Holland was finally granted a meeting, it was brief and inconclusive. The atmospherics were tense. Holland, understanding the gravity of what he was carrying, and almost certainly uncomfortable with the role he had been assigned, tried to convey British sincerity about the options. Gensoll, who had sent an immediate communication to the French Admiralty in Vichy, framing the situation as a British ultimatum of force, with the options themselves given little elaboration, was already locked into a defensive posture. And that framing matters enormously, because Vichy's response to the crisis was shaped by what Gensoll told them was happening. What he told them was that Britain was demanding the fleet submit or be destroyed. The more nuanced alternatives, the Caribbean option, the demilitarization possibilities were, depending on the account you trust, either omitted or so compressed in the reporting that they registered as window dressing rather than genuine pathways. The French Admiralty's reply ordered Gensoll to resist any attempt to seize the ships by force. This was essentially the answer to a question that wasn't quite the question being asked, but by the time that distinction might have mattered, the communication loop had already closed around a much simpler version of events. Meanwhile, signals were going wrong in both directions. The British squadron commander outside the harbour, Admiral Somerville, was receiving pressure from London to resolve the situation before nightfall, partly out of genuine strategic anxiety about French submarines and the vulnerability of the British ships in the approaches, and partly because Churchill and the War Cabinet were watching the clock with the kind of urgency that does not make room for the slower rhythms of diplomacy. That pressure was transmitted down the chain in ways that shortened the available time and narrowed the space for improvisation. Every hour that passed without resolution was read in London not as negotiation in progress, but as delay being used to prepare resistance or await reinforcement. There is evidence that at certain points during the afternoon, the situation may have come close to something workable. Some accounts suggest that Gensoll, in a later stage of the talks, indicated a willingness to discuss demilitarization in place, reducing the ship's combat readiness in a way that might have satisfied British concerns without requiring the fleet to sail anywhere. Whether this represented a genuine offer or a stalling tactic, and whether Holland communicated its potential back to Somerville with sufficient urgency and precision, remains contested. What seems clear is that whatever flexibility existed on the French side arrived late, was communicated imperfectly, and reached Somerville at a point when London's patience had effectively run out. There is also the question of what both sides actually believed about the other's intentions. Gensol and his officers seem to have concluded relatively early that the British were going to fire regardless, that the options were theatre and the outcome predetermined. This reading, whether accurate or not, had a self-fulfilling quality. If you believe negotiation is pointless, you stop negotiating in good faith, which then confirms the other side's suspicion that you're simply running out the clock. The British, for their part, interpreted every hour of French resistance as evidence that the fleet was preparing to fight or flee, which reinforced the pressure to act before the tactical situation deteriorated further. Neither side was entirely wrong in its suspicions, and yet neither side was entirely right either. The British were genuinely prepared to use force, but there is reason to believe Somerville himself was deeply reluctant and might have responded to a cleaner French offer. The French were genuinely determined to resist foreign seizure of their ships, but there were almost certainly officers in that harbour who understood privately that the armistice was a fragile thing and that Britain's fears about the fleet were not irrational. What collapsed in those hours was not simply a negotiation. It was the possibility of finding a shared framework for the problem, some language that could have acknowledged British strategic necessity without requiring French officers to perform an act they experienced as institutional suicide. That kind of language is hard to construct under any circumstances. It is nearly impossible to construct when the clock is running, the guns are loaded, the chain of command on one side is issuing orders based on incomplete information, and the pride of two proud naval traditions has been made into a zero-sum contest. By late afternoon the window was closing. Messages that might have changed the calculation were delayed, misread, or arrived too late to alter decisions already in motion. Personal slights, real and perceived, had made the human channel between Holland and Gensol too narrow and too strained to carry the weight of what needed to pass through it. And in London the War Cabinet was no longer asking whether violence could be avoided. It was asking when. The chain of failures that produced what came next was not the work of villains. It was the work of men operating under impossible pressures, through imperfect communications, across a gulf of mutual incomprehension that neither side had the time, the tools, or perhaps the will to fully bridge. At approximately 5:45 in the afternoon, on the 3rd of July, 1940, Admiral James Somerville gave the order. After hours of ultimatums, failed negotiations, and mounting pressure from London, Force H opened fire on the French fleet anchored in the harbour of Mers-el-Kébir. The ships in the harbour had not sailed, the terms had not been accepted. The clock, as London had been insisting for hours, had run out. What followed in the next several minutes was one of the most concentrated and destructive naval bombardments of the war, not between enemies who had been fighting each other for years, but between two fleets that had been allies less than a month before, whose sailors had trained on overlapping doctrines, who in some cases knew each other personally, and who now found themselves on opposite sides of a catastrophe none of them had sought or expected. Somerville's force, the battle-cruiser HMS Hood, the battleships Valiant and Resolution, the carrier Ark Royal, and a screen of cruisers and destroyers, had been positioned outside the harbour entrance throughout the day. The range was relatively short. The French ships, moored in a configuration not designed for combat, were largely confined by the geography of the harbour itself. Mers-el-Kébir was not a deep-water anchorage with room to manoeuvre. It was a compressed, sheltered port, and the ships inside it were, in a tactical sense, caught. The French fleet at anchor included some of the most powerful warships France possessed. The battle-cruisers Dunkirk and Strasbourg were the pride of the Marine Nationale, fast, modern, designed explicitly to counter German and Italian capital ships. The older battleships Bretagne and Provence were also present, along with the seaplane tender Commandant Testi and a number of destroyers. These were not second-line vessels. They represented a significant portion of French naval striking power, and that was precisely why they were here, in this moment, absorbing fire from the fleet that had been their partner. The opening salvo struck quickly and with devastating effect. The Britannia took multiple hits almost immediately. She was an aging ship, commissioned during the First World War, and her ability to absorb modern shellfire was limited. Within minutes she was burning severely. The fire reached her magazines. She capsized and sank in the harbour, taking the great majority of her crew with her. Of the roughly 1,000 men aboard, fewer than 200 survived. The speed of her sinking gave almost no time for evacuation. Men trapped below decks had no chance. Those on the upper works who survived the initial blasts faced fire, smoke, and rapidly flooding water in near simultaneous succession. The Dunkirk was struck by multiple shells and driven aground near the harbour's edge to prevent her sinking in deep water. She was badly damaged. Her forward gun turrets were knocked out, and her hull breached in several places, but she did not sink immediately. Her captain's decision to beach her was a naval instinct to preserve both ship and crew from total loss. She would survive the initial attack, though in a heavily compromised state, and this would matter for what came after. The Provence was also hit and damaged severely enough that she too was beached to keep from going under. She was out of the fight, though she remained afloat. The Strasbourg moored further into the harbour, and perhaps benefiting from the smoke and confusion that had settled over the anchorage, managed something that British planners had hoped to prevent. Under fire, and under cover of a destroyer smoke screen, she got under way. Her captain, Capitaine de Vaisseau Louis Collinet, used the chaos of the bombardment to thread the harbour entrance and break out into open water. British destroyers attempted to intercept her. Aircraft from the Ark Royal were launched in pursuit. None of it was enough. The Strasbourg, damaged but still combat-capable, escaped and eventually reached Toulon. For the British, this was an immediate and significant failure of the operation's central objective. One of the two most powerful French capital ships had slipped through. The bombardment itself lasted approximately 10 minutes of intense fire, though the total engagement stretched longer as British forces attempted to prevent escapes and confirm the extent of damage. The harbour, by the end of this concentrated shelling, was a scene of wreckage and fire. The Britannia was gone. The Provence and Dunkirk were aground and disabled. Destroyers and smaller vessels had been hit, some sunk, others damaged. The harbour's confined geometry, which had made the French ships so vulnerable to concentrated fire, now compounded the human disaster. Burning ships in a closed anchorage left little space for rescue operations in the immediate aftermath. Men in the water contended with oil, fire, and the residue of exploding magazines. The final toll was staggering by any measure. Somewhere in the range of 1,200 French sailors were killed. The precise figure varies slightly across sources, but every credible account places it in 4 figures. These were not combatants who had been firing on British ships. They were men sitting at anchor in a harbour they believed was, if not safe, at least subject to negotiation. Many of them died not in the opening impacts, but in the subsequent fires and flooding, trapped by the rapid deterioration of their ships and the impossible circumstances of a harbour that had become a killing ground through no act of their own. Somerville himself, by multiple accounts, was shaken by what his guns had done. He had argued against the operation before it was launched, had pushed for more time to negotiate, and had sent messages to London expressing reluctance that bordered on resistance. He carried out the order because he was a naval officer, and it was a direct command. But contemporary accounts and his own later statements suggest he derived no satisfaction from what happened that afternoon. That personal anguish does not alter the death toll, but it complicates any simple reading of the men who executed the plan as cold or willing. The harbour fell quiet eventually. The smoke drifted off the North African coast. British ships withdrew. French rescue operations began. What had started that morning as a diplomatic confrontation, fraught complicated, entirely possible to read as negotiations that might yet yield a result, had ended in one of the most concentrated acts of destruction one former ally had ever inflicted upon another. The strategic logic that had driven Churchill and the War Cabinet to this point did not vanish in the aftermath. But neither did the wreckage, the fires still burning on beached ships, or the 1,200 men who would not return to France. The smoke had barely cleared from Mers-el-Kébir before the political tremors began, and they moved in opposite directions with equal force. In France, the reaction was not simply anger, it was something closer to a wound that would never fully close. In Britain, the government moved with calculated speed to transform a brutal act into a statement of resolve. Both responses hardened into narratives that would shape the relationship between the two countries for the remainder of the war, and in some ways far beyond it. In Vichy France, the attack landed like a confirmation of everything that certain French leaders had suspected about their former ally. Marshal Peytain's government broke off diplomatic relations with Britain almost immediately. The French ambassador in London was recalled. These were not merely formal gestures, they reflected a genuine eruption of rage within Vichy circles, where men who had already made their peace with the armistice now pointed to Mers-el-Kébir as proof that Britain had never been a true partner, that London had always been prepared to sacrifice French lives for its own survival. The Vichy propaganda machine moved quickly. French state radio described the attack as an act of piracy, a cold-blooded betrayal, an assault carried out against sailors who had posed no threat and sought no fight. The framing was deliberate. France had been stabbed in the back by the ally it had bled alongside in 2 world wars, and the men who died in that harbour were martyrs to British cynicism rather than casualties of strategic calculation. The grief among French naval officers ran particularly deep, and was not simply a political performance. The Marine Nationale had possessed a genuine institutional pride and a fierce sense of honour. French sailors who survived the attack, or who heard about it from those who had, carried a bitterness that was personal in a way that extended well beyond Vichy politics. Admiral Gensol, who had spent the day negotiating under what he regarded as coercive and ultimately dishonest pressure, filed reports that portrayed the British ultimatum as having been structured to fail, as something designed to produce a pretext for attack rather than a genuine opportunity for resolution. Whether that interpretation was accurate or not, it was widely believed within the French naval establishment, and it poisoned the relationship between British and French naval officers in ways that mattered operationally for years. The consequences were not only diplomatic. Vichy France launched retaliatory airstrikes against Gibraltar in the days following the attack. Relatively limited in scope, but a signal that the French government was prepared to demonstrate its hostility in military terms. The relationship between Britain and Vichy, already delicate by the nature of the armistice, moved into something colder and more openly adversarial. Future British operations involving French colonial territories in West Africa, in the Middle East, eventually in North Africa, would have to contend with a Vichy military establishment that had been given a potent emotional reason to resist rather than accommodate. The ghost of Mers-el-Kébir haunted every subsequent negotiation, every attempted alliance with French commanders in the field. When Britain and Free French forces attempted to take Dakar in September 1940, Vichy defenders repelled the attack with a ferocity that drew at least some of its energy from the fury that had been building since July. The question of how Free France, Charles de Gaulle and the small movement that had rallied to London absorbed the attack is particularly complicated. De Gaulle was in an almost impossible position. He had just made his appeal from London, had staked his credibility on the argument that France and Britain were still partners in the fight against Germany. Mers-el-Kébir arrived as a thunderbolt that could have shattered that argument entirely. De Gaulle's response was carefully measured. He acknowledged the British decision with evident pain, expressed understanding of the strategic logic behind it, while making clear its human cost, and tried to prevent the attack from becoming the defining rupture it threatened to be. That he managed to hold his movement together through this moment is, depending on your perspective, either a tribute to his political skill or a measure of how few alternatives the Free French actually had. In Britain, the government's justification was swift and, domestically at least, largely effective. Churchill addressed the House of Commons on the 4th of July and delivered one of his more remarkable performances, not in the sense of oratory for its own sake, but in how precisely he calibrated the presentation. He laid out the logic plainly. France had signed an armistice. The armistice had placed the French fleet in a position of uncertainty. Germany had made assurances about not using that fleet, and those assurances were worthless. Britain could not stake its survival on the word of Adolf Hitler. The decision had been taken not in anger, not in vengeance, but in cold necessity. And if that necessity had cost French lives, the responsibility ultimately lay with those who had placed the fleet in an ambiguous position rather than those who had resolved the ambiguity through force. The House received this argument with something that genuinely surprised Churchill: sustained, emotional applause. Members across party lines rose in approval. There had been anxiety in Westminster about the decision, but once it was framed as an act of survival rather than aggression, the political class largely embraced it. The British public followed in the same direction. Newspapers that might have expressed ambivalence instead ran headlines that positioned Mers-el-Kébir as proof of national determination. The government had done a terrible thing. Yes, but it had done it because Britain was fighting alone and could afford no risk. That framing took hold quickly and never really let go, at least not in Britain. What emerged from both responses was a pair of narratives that were each internally coherent but fundamentally incompatible. The French narrative emphasized betrayal, disproportionate violence, and the death of men who had been allies hours before. The British narrative emphasized survival, strategic logic, and the absence of any guaranteed alternative. Neither side was inventing its position. The French dead were real. The strategic stakes were real. The tragedy of Mers-el-Kébir was precisely that. Both narratives had genuine purchase on the truth, which made the bitterness it generated so durable. It was not the kind of event that either side could simply absorb and move past. It lodged in the memory of the relationship and resurfaced every time Britain and France found themselves negotiating over difficult things, which in the years ahead they did constantly and in conditions that were already hard enough, without the weight of a harbour full of wreckage pressing down on every conversation. The question hangs over everything that happened at Mers-el-Kébir, and it refuses to be answered cleanly. The competing narratives of betrayal and necessity that emerged in the aftermath both contained truth. But what neither fully addressed was the more fundamental issue underneath. Was the attack actually required? Or did Britain choose the most drastic option when less violent paths still existed? That question deserves to be taken seriously on its own terms, because it is not a simple one, and the people who argue on both sides of it are not simply rationalizing. They are grappling with one of the genuinely hard moral and strategic problems of the entire war. Start with the strongest case for necessity, because it is genuinely strong. By the summer of 1940, Britain was not operating from a position of strategic comfort, where it could afford to take considered risks on the goodwill of uncertain partners. France had collapsed with a speed that had astonished virtually every military planner on the Allied side. The armistice terms as written technically prohibited France from surrendering the fleet to Germany, but armistice terms are pieces of paper, and Germany had demonstrated throughout the 1930s a comprehensive disregard for pieces of paper when it suited German interests. Churchill and his cabinet were not being paranoid when they asked themselves what would happen if the Vichy government found the armistice terms increasingly unworkable, or if German pressure intensified, or if the political balance within Vichy shifted further toward outright collaboration. The honest answer was that nobody knew, and in a war that Britain could lose catastrophically, and perhaps irreversibly, not knowing was not a position from which to gamble. The naval arithmetic was stark in a way that made comfortable abstraction difficult. The French fleet, particularly its capital ships, represented a genuine shift in the balance of power at sea if it ever passed under Axis control. The Royal Navy was stretched across multiple theatres, protecting Atlantic supply lines, guarding the Mediterranean, watching the North Sea. Adding the combined weight of French and Italian naval power to the German threat was not a scenario Britain could absorb. Control of the seas was not simply a strategic advantage for Britain, it was the precondition for national survival. Lose it, and the island could be starved into submission or invaded. That was not rhetoric. That was geography. And yet the counter-arguments are not weak, and they need to be confronted honestly. The most significant is the one that critics of the attack raised at the time, and have continued to raise since. The French naval leadership had already demonstrated, in the hours and days before the ultimatum was delivered, a fierce determination not to allow their ships to fall into German hands. Admiral Darlan, whatever his other political compromises, had given explicit orders that the fleet was to be scuttled rather than surrendered. Those orders were known. They were not secret. French officers had a deep institutional revulsion at the idea of their ships serving under a German flag, a revulsion that was not merely rhetorical, but had practical and historical roots. The French Navy had fought alongside Britain. Its officers understood what a German-controlled French fleet would mean for the war. There was reason, not merely hope, to believe that the armistice clauses about the fleet would hold, not because Germany would honour them, but because the French sailors themselves would refuse to cooperate with any attempt to subvert them. There were also alternatives within Operation Catapult that received less vigorous pursuit than they might have. Ships that were in British ports when the operation was executed were seized with minimal violence. That part of Catapult worked. French submarines and other vessels in Alexandria reached a negotiated standoff that, while tense, did not result in bloodshed. These outcomes suggest that the Mers-el-Kébir ultimatum was not the only possible approach to the French squadron there, and that the time given to Admiral Gensoul to respond, and the manner in which the options were presented to him, shaped the outcome as much as any underlying strategic logic. Critics have long argued that the ultimatum was structured in a way that French naval honour made almost impossible to accept, and that more time, different framing, or direct communication with Paris, rather than just Gensoul, might have opened alternatives that were never seriously tested. So did Britain act on evidence, on fear, or on some combination of the two? Almost certainly the third, and that is not a criticism. It is simply an honest description of how decisions get made in conditions of genuine strategic crisis. Churchill had evidence that the armistice terms were ambiguous, and that German intentions were not trustworthy. He had evidence that the French fleet represented an enormous potential shift in naval power. He had evidence that negotiations were breaking down. But he also had fear, well-founded, rationally grounded fear, but fear nonetheless, that the worst possible outcome was not merely possible but plausible, and that waiting to see how events unfolded could mean waiting until it was too late to act at all. The decision to strike at Mers-el-Kébir was not made because the evidence proved that the French fleet was about to fall into German hands. It was made because the evidence could not prove that it would not, and in a war being fought with Britain's back against the wall, that uncertainty was treated as equivalent to confirmed danger. This is where the deepest truth about Mers-el-Kébir becomes visible, and it applies far beyond this single event. Wartime decisions of this magnitude are almost never made on the basis of proof. They are made on the basis of risk assessment under conditions of radical uncertainty, where the cost of being wrong in one direction can be survivable and the cost of being wrong in the other direction can be catastrophic and irreversible. Churchill chose the action that eliminated the risk he feared most, and he accepted that the cost of eliminating it would be measured in French lives and in the permanent damage to an alliance that Britain still needed in some form. Whether a different leader with a different calculus might have found a path that achieved the same strategic security without firing a single shell is a question that history cannot definitively answer, because history only records what happened, not what might have. What can be said is that Britain was not operating in conditions where good options were plentiful. The choice was never between a clean solution and a dirty one. It was between different categories of terrible risk, assessed under extreme time pressure, with incomplete information, by people who knew they were making a decision they would have to live with forever. That does not make the decision right. But it does make the question of whether Britain had a choice considerably more complicated than either side's preferred narrative has ever been willing to admit. To fully understand whether British fears were calibrated to reality, you have to look at the crisis from the other side, and ask what Germany and Italy were actually thinking about the French fleet in the summer of 1940. Because the Axis view of that fleet was more complicated, more contradictory, and in some ways more revealing than the straightforward threat narrative that drove British policy. Start with Hitler, because his position was the one that mattered most. By the time the armistice was signed in June 1940, Germany had achieved something that had eluded it in 4 years of grinding war between 1914 and 1918, the complete military defeat of France. That achievement was intoxicating, and it created within the Nazi leadership a particular strategic confidence, perhaps even overconfidence, about what came next. Hitler's primary focus in the summer of 1940 was Britain. He still hoped, at least intermittently, that Britain might negotiate rather than fight on, and the armistice terms he imposed on France were deliberately designed with that hope in mind. The French fleet clause, the one that technically prohibited Germany from claiming the ships, was not generosity. It was calculated restraint. Hitler understood that if Germany had openly seized the French navy, it would have alarmed every neutral power watching the settlement, given Britain a concrete and undeniable provocation, and potentially driven the fleet itself into British ports before German forces could act. Restraint was the smarter play, at least in the short term. But restraint is not the same as disinterest, and here the picture becomes more nuanced. German naval planners, particularly Grand Admiral Raeder, absolutely understood the potential value of French warships. The Kriegsmarine was the weakest of Germany's 3 services in relative terms, chronically short of the surface warships that could challenge British dominance of the Atlantic sea lanes. The prospect of acquiring French capital ships, destroyers and submarines was not something German naval staff dismissed. They discussed it, they planned around it, and they advised Hitler accordingly. What they concluded, however, was that direct seizure in the summer of 1940 was politically premature. The armistice terms were a framework, not a ceiling. If circumstances changed, if Britain continued to fight, if the war extended, if Vichy France moved further toward full collaboration, the question of the fleet could be revisited on German terms. This is the tension that runs through the entire Axis position. Germany wanted to keep the French fleet as a future option rather than exploit it as an immediate asset. Hitler preferred political leverage to outright control, at least for now. A French fleet that remained technically French but was bound by armistice terms and susceptible to German pressure was arguably more useful to him than a fleet openly flying German colours, which would have triggered exactly the kind of British and American alarm he was managing around. The ambiguity was the point. An uncertain fleet was a fleet that kept Britain guessing, that kept Vichy dependent on German goodwill, and that could be converted into something more concrete if the strategic situation demanded it. Mussolini's position added another layer of complexity that is sometimes overlooked. Italy had its own ambitions in the Mediterranean, and those ambitions were not perfectly aligned with Germany's. The Italian navy, the Regia Marina, was a significant force on paper, and Mussolini had visions of Mediterranean dominance that had been central to fascist ideology since the 1920s. A large French fleet passing under joint Axis control, or even remaining immobilized at Toulon, within Italian sphere of influence, was not straightforwardly welcome in Rome. Italy was a German ally, but it was also a competitor for Mediterranean primacy, and Mussolini had no particular desire to see German naval power dramatically extended into waters he considered an Italian sea. The Axis, in other words, was not a unified entity with a single coherent strategy for the French fleet. It was an alliance of competing ambitions that happened to be cooperating against a common enemy. So where does this leave the British fear that drove Mers-el-Kébir? The honest assessment is that British concerns were not invented. They were grounded in a genuine understanding of what German naval planners wanted, and what German strategic flexibility might eventually produce. But the fears probably exceeded what German capability and intention could deliver in the immediate term. In the summer of 1940, Germany lacked the trained personnel to operate French warships effectively. The Kriegsmarine was already stretched. Integrating a foreign fleet with different systems, different languages and crews deeply hostile to serving German interests was not something that could happen quickly or smoothly. The gap between the theoretical value of the French fleet to Germany and Germany's actual near-term ability to exploit it was significant, and British intelligence had some sense of this, even if the political pressure to act decisively overwhelmed the more cautious technical assessments. What the Axis crisis actually revealed when you step back from it is how much of the strategic danger was potential rather than immediate. Germany held the French fleet as an option, as leverage, as a card that could be played later. Britain chose to remove that card before it could be played at all, which is rational crisis management, but also a decision that assumed the worst-case scenario would eventually materialize rather than waiting to see whether cooler heads and French resistance might have kept the fleet out of German hands indefinitely. The Mediterranean context matters here too. The broader war at sea in 1940 was already stretching British resources to their limits. Italian entry into the war had opened a second naval theatre at precisely the wrong moment, turning the Mediterranean from a manageable liability into an active front, requiring constant British attention. The Royal Navy was simultaneously trying to keep Atlantic supply lines open, deter invasion across the English Channel, contest the Mediterranean against the Regia Marina, and now manage the uncertain presence of a French fleet in North African ports. In that context, the Axis approach to the French fleet, patient, leveraged, deliberately ambiguous, was in some ways more strategically sophisticated than what Britain ended up doing. Germany got leverage from the fleet without firing a shot. Britain eliminated a threat, but in doing so handed the Axis a different kind of weapon, a grievance that would define Franco-British relations for years, that pushed Vichy France further into the German orbit, and that complicated every subsequent attempt to draw the French back into the Allied cause. The Axis view of Mers-el-Kébir, when it finally registered in Berlin and Rome, was not horror. It was something closer to satisfaction, though perhaps with a degree of surprise at how thoroughly Britain had done Germany's political work for it. What Germany gained politically from Mers-el-Kébir, almost as a side effect, Britain had actually intended as a central purpose. Because Churchill was not only thinking about ships when he ordered the attack, he was thinking about audiences, and specifically about the audience that mattered most to Britain's survival in the summer of 1940, the United States. To understand why the political signal may have been as important to Churchill as the naval result, you have to understand just how uncertain American policy was in those weeks. Franklin Roosevelt wanted to help Britain. He believed, probably correctly, that an Axis-dominated Europe was incompatible with long-term American security and interests. But Roosevelt was operating under enormous domestic constraints. American public opinion was deeply resistant to involvement in another European war. The memory of the First World War, of American boys dying in trenches for what many had come to regard as European imperial squabbles, had hardened into a powerful isolationist sentiment that dominated Congress and shaped what any president could politically do. The Neutrality Acts were not just legal obstacles. They reflected a genuine national mood, and into this environment came the fall of France, an event that shocked American observers not just as tragedy but as revelation. If France, with one of the largest armies in Europe, with the supposedly impregnable Maginot Line, with a century of military tradition behind it, could collapse in 6 weeks, what did that say about Britain's prospects? American military assessments in the summer of 1940 were, frankly, pessimistic. Senior figures in the War Department were advising Roosevelt that Britain might not last. selling arms and material to a country that was about to fall and surrender its equipment to Germany, seemed not just futile but actively counterproductive. The question of whether Britain could actually hold, and whether it would fight to the last, rather than negotiate a compromise peace, was not rhetorical. It was the central question determining what American policy could or would do. Churchill understood this with total clarity. Every statement he made about fighting on the beaches, every refusal to enter negotiations, every dramatic gesture of defiance was partly addressed to a domestic British audience and partly to Washington. Mers-el-Kébir fits squarely within that pattern. The attack said something that speeches alone could not quite prove, that Britain was willing to pay real costs, make terrible decisions, and destroy former friendships rather than accept any outcome that risked defeat. A country planning to negotiate with Hitler does not shell a French fleet and kill nearly 1,300 French sailors. The ruthlessness of the act was, paradoxically, part of its message. It demonstrated not just willingness to fight, but a coldness of strategic calculation that suggested Britain had genuinely committed itself to a long war. The reaction in Washington was, by most accounts, significant. American observers who had been sceptical of British resolve found the attack striking evidence that Churchill's government was serious. Roosevelt, who was already inclined to find ways to assist Britain, now had a concrete demonstration of British determination that helped him make the political case for increased support. Whether Mers-el-Kébir directly influenced the subsequent destroyers for bases agreement, which was announced in early September 1940, is impossible to prove with certainty. History rarely offers that kind of clean causation. But the attack was clearly part of a pattern of evidence that shifted how American decision-makers read British prospects. And that shift had enormous consequences for everything that followed. Neutral observers beyond the United States were also watching, and their calculus was different but related. Countries that had not yet taken sides, Spain, Turkey, Sweden, nations across Latin America, were making constant assessments of which direction the war was likely to go. Backing a losing side in a major conflict was a catastrophic error that small and medium powers had learned to avoid. Any signal that Britain was weakening, wavering, or moving toward accommodation would have accelerated a drift toward accommodation with the Axis that could have gradually closed off British access to resources, intelligence, and diplomatic support from across the world. Mers-el-Kébir sent the opposite signal. It said that Britain was not calculating retreat, it was calculating domination of whatever outcome it could control. Here the distinction between military necessity and political theatre becomes genuinely complicated, and it is worth sitting with that complexity rather than resolving it too cleanly in either direction. Critics of Churchill's decision have argued that the attack was, at least partly, theatre, a dramatic demonstration calculated for foreign consumption that sacrificed French lives and Franco-British relations for a propaganda effect. That charge is not entirely without basis. The military threat from the French fleet at Mers-el-Kébir was real, but not immediate. The political urgency Churchill felt was arguably greater than the tactical danger in that specific week. There is something uncomfortable about a strategic decision where the audience watching matters as much as the actual outcome. But the counter-argument is that in the summer of 1940, the line between military necessity and political communication had essentially dissolved. Britain's survival depended on American support, and American support depended on American belief in British resolve. A decision that strengthened that belief was a decision that contributed directly to British military survival. The political signal and the strategic objective were not separable. Churchill was not putting on a show for its own sake. He was fighting for his country's life with every instrument available, and perception was one of those instruments. Leadership in existential crisis has always required this dual nature, addressing the immediate tactical reality, while simultaneously managing the larger narrative within which that reality will be judged and responded to. Whether the action strengthened deterrence in the broader sense is more ambiguous. Against Germany, it probably did demonstrate that Britain could not be easily intimidated into neutrality or negotiation. Against Vichy France, it had the opposite effect. deepening hostility and driving Vichy policy in directions that complicated later Allied operations in North Africa. The deterrence it provided against some actors was purchased partly at the expense of the credibility and goodwill it destroyed with others. What Mers-el-Kébir ultimately reveals about Churchill's leadership is that he was willing to pay asymmetric prices, to sacrifice something real and irreplaceable in the short term, to purchase something essential for the long term. Whether that trade was worth it is a question that reasonable people have disagreed about ever since. But that he made the calculation deliberately, and that the political signal was woven into the decision from the beginning, seems beyond serious doubt. The attack at Mers-el-Kébir was not the end of the French Navy's story. It was, in a strange way, closer to the beginning of a long, painful drama about honour, sovereignty, and the impossible choices that occupation forces onto those trying to preserve something of both. To understand whether Britain's fears were ultimately vindicated, you have to follow the fleet forward, past 1940, past Vichy's bitter years, all the way to a harbour in the south of France, where the final act played out in ways that neither Churchill nor anyone else had fully anticipated. After July 1940, the surviving French naval forces were split between two trajectories. A portion joined Charles de Gaulle's Free French movement and continued fighting alongside the Allies, a fact that sometimes gets lost in the broader narrative of Franco-British rupture. But the bulk of the fleet, particularly the powerful warships based in French metropolitan and colonial ports, remained under Vichy control, and the man most responsible for their fate was Admiral François Darlan, the commander of the French Navy, who became one of the most controversial figures of the entire war. A man the British deeply distrusted, the Germans never fully controlled, and historians have argued about ever since. Darlan was not a collaborator in the ideological sense. He did not share Nazi ideology, and he nursed a genuine professional pride in the French Navy as an institution separate from the catastrophe that had swallowed the army and the Republic. His core objective, as best historians can reconstruct it, was to preserve the fleet intact as both a symbol of French sovereignty and a bargaining chip, a source of leverage that Vichy could use to maintain whatever limited autonomy it possessed within the German-dominated New Order. He repeatedly assured the Germans, the British, and anyone else who asked that he would never allow the fleet to fall into Axis hands. Whether he meant it sincerely, and whether that promise was worth anything given the realities of occupation, was precisely the question that haunted British strategic planners throughout the years that followed. The next major crisis point came not in France, but in the Mediterranean, as Allied fortunes shifted through 1941 and 1942. At various moments, Vichy French naval forces engaged Allied ships in combat, most dramatically during the Allied landings in North Africa in November 1942, when French forces initially resisted the invasion before Darlan, who happened to be in Algiers at the time, negotiated a ceasefire in circumstances that remain murky and contested. The political firestorm that followed, over whether the Allies should be dealing with Darlan at all, given his Vichy associations, exposed just how thoroughly the French naval question had become entangled with larger questions about legitimacy, collaboration, and post-war France. But the moment that most directly addresses whether British fears were validated came in November 1942 as well, in the harbour at Toulon, when German forces moved to occupy Vichy France in response to the North African landings, ending the fiction of the unoccupied zone. They immediately moved toward Toulon with orders to seize the fleet. What happened next was, depending on your perspective, either a vindication of French naval honour or a tragic outcome that proved British fears had not been entirely wrong, or possibly both simultaneously. The French officers at Toulon, faced with the German advance, made the decision to scuttle. Over the course of a single morning, their crews opened seacocks, set charges, and deliberately sank their own ships rather than allow them to be captured. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, the bulk of the Vichy fleet went to the bottom of the harbour. Roughly 77 vessels were scuttled in an act that the officers involved clearly regarded as the fulfilment of their honour and their promises. Now, Here is where hindsight has to be handled carefully, because this is exactly the kind of later evidence that can distort our understanding of what Britain actually faced in 1940. The scuttling at Toulon is sometimes cited as proof that British fears were overblown, that French officers would never have surrendered the fleet to the Axis regardless of what Britain did or did not do. But this reading imposes the outcome of 1942 onto the uncertainty of 1940, and that is a genuine analytical error. The French officers who scuttled their ships in 1942 were acting after 2 years of occupation, after watching Germany's conduct across Europe, after the entire moral and political landscape of the war had crystallized in ways that were not yet clear in the summer of 1940. The men who controlled the fleet in July 1940 were operating in a moment of shock, defeat, and genuine ambiguity about what the armistice meant and where the war was going. Moreover, even the Toulon scuttling was not a complete success from the Allied perspective. Several submarines managed to escape, and some fell into Italian hands, at least temporarily. German salvage teams subsequently raised and attempted to repair portions of the fleet, though with limited success. The scuttling prevented Axis operational use of the ships, but barely, and not without complications. It was not a clean vindication of the argument that the fleet would have been safe under Vichy stewardship all along. What the full arc of the French fleet story actually suggests is something more nuanced than either side in the debate about Mers-el-Kébir tends to acknowledge. French naval officers did, in the end, act to preserve their honour and deny the fleet to Germany. That is real, and it deserves recognition. But the path to that outcome ran through 2 years of Vichy collaboration, Atlantic and Mediterranean engagements against the Allies, and a crisis that only resolved itself under extreme pressure at the last possible moment. Whether that trajectory justified what Britain did in July 1940 depends on how much weight you give to the ambiguity of the situation Britain actually faced, not the outcome France eventually arrived at. The fleet that Churchill feared in 1940 and the fleet that chose scuttling in 1942 existed in fundamentally different strategic contexts, under different pressures, with different information and different time to act. Judging the decision at Mers-el-Kébir by what happened at Toulon is like judging whether to treat an illness by noting that the patient eventually recovered. The later outcome tells you something, but it does not tell you everything, and it certainly does not tell you what the right decision was in the moment of maximum danger and minimum certainty. The question of what actually happened at Mers-el-Kébir is relatively settled. The question of what it meant, whether it was justified, necessary, wise, or morally defensible, has generated disagreement among historians for more than 80 years, and that debate shows no sign of reaching a comfortable consensus. If anything, as archives have opened, memoirs have been re-examined, and scholars from different national traditions have brought different assumptions to the evidence, the interpretive landscape has become more complicated rather than less. The earliest historical judgments were shaped almost entirely by British perspectives, and for understandable reasons. In the immediate post-war years, the dominant narrative of the conflict was one of Allied solidarity, Churchill's inspired leadership, and Britain's heroic stand against overwhelming odds. Within that framework, Mers-el-Kébir was treated as a painful but necessary act of strategic realism, the kind of ruthless decision that separates leaders who win wars from those who lose them. Churchill himself contributed significantly to this interpretation through his memoirs, which presented the attack as a demonstration of British resolve that served vital strategic purposes, both in denying the fleet to Germany and in signalling to the world, and to Roosevelt specifically, that Britain intended to fight regardless of the cost. Most British historians writing in the 1950s and 1960s broadly accepted this framing, treating the episode as a regrettable necessity that reflected well on Churchill's willingness to make hard choices. French historians, working from a fundamentally different experience of the war, reached very different conclusions. For France, the Vichy years were a source of profound national trauma, a wound that took decades to even partially acknowledge, let alone process. In the early post-war period, the French national narrative emphasized resistance and sacrifice, and the memory of Mers-el-Kébir fit into that narrative as a British betrayal, an unprovoked attack on sailors who had already been defeated and who posed no real threat to the Allied cause. French accounts tended to emphasize the inadequacy of the ultimatum, the failure to allow enough time for negotiations, the cultural arrogance implicit in the British assumption that French officers could not be trusted to honour their own word. The 1,300 men who died in the harbour became, in French memory, victims of British panic and Churchill's egotism as much as casualties of war. These two national memories were not simply interpreting the same facts differently. They were, in many cases, emphasizing genuinely different facts, prioritizing different kinds of evidence, and asking fundamentally different questions about what justification actually requires. British accounts asked whether the strategic logic was sound given what Britain knew in July 1940. French accounts asked whether the attack was proportionate, whether the diplomatic process was conducted in good faith, and whether the deaths of French sailors could be morally justified by strategic calculations made in London. Neither question is wrong, but they lead to very different assessments. The revisionist turn in British historiography began gaining traction from roughly the 1970s onward, as historians became less willing to accept Churchill's own framing of events at face value and began interrogating the archives more rigorously. Several important questions emerged from this work. Was the threat from the French fleet genuinely as acute as Churchill presented it? Were the terms of the armistice actually as dangerous as British intelligence assessed? Or were there more reassuring readings of what France had agreed to? And critically, was the ultimatum offered at Mers-el-Kébir genuinely designed to produce a negotiated outcome? Or was it structured in a way that made French acceptance practically impossible, thereby providing political cover for a decision that had already been made? Some revisionist historians have argued that the British negotiating process was conducted with insufficient patience, and that Admiral Gensel's failure to transmit the full range of options to his superiors in Paris, combined with British signals intelligence intercepting French communications and accelerating the timeline, created a diplomatic collapse that was not entirely inevitable. Others have pushed further, suggesting that Churchill's primary motivation at Mers-el-Kébir was less about the actual strategic threat posed by those specific ships, and more about the political signal the attack would send, to Washington, to Berlin, and to the British public. On this reading, the French sailors died at least partly as instruments of a messaging strategy, which raises uncomfortable questions about proportionality and ends justifying means reasoning. The opening of British and French archives in subsequent decades added texture without resolving the core disputes. Documents revealed the genuine anxiety within the British Admiralty about the fleet, but also some internal uncertainty about whether the worst-case scenarios were realistic. Memoirs from French naval officers who survived the attack illuminated the depth of the outrage and the sense of betrayal felt in the fleet, feelings that persisted for years and shaped Franco-British relations in ways that Churchill's post-war framing had somewhat minimised. The role of Admiral Darlan, his communications, his assurances, his ambiguities, became a recurring subject of analysis, with historians divided on whether his promises were substantive or hollow, sincere or self-serving. What makes Mers-el-Kébir particularly difficult to adjudicate is that it sits at the intersection of several different kinds of historical judgment simultaneously. There is the question of strategic logic. Was Britain right about the threat? There is the question of diplomatic process. Was the ultimatum conducted in good faith? There is the question of moral proportionality. Were 1,300 deaths a defensible price for the strategic outcome? And there is the meta-question of how we weigh Churchill's own testimony about his intentions against the documentary record and the reasonable inferences that can be drawn from British behaviour. Reasonable historians, working from the same evidence, have reached genuinely different conclusions about each of these questions. What is perhaps most striking about the historiography, taken as a whole, is that both the traditional defence and the revisionist critique contain real insights that the other tends to underweight. Churchill was operating in conditions of extreme uncertainty with legitimate strategic fears, and the French fleet genuinely did represent a significant variable in the naval balance. At the same time, the attack was conducted in a diplomatic framework that allowed remarkably little room for the French side to manoeuvre, and the deaths it produced fell on men who were, by any reasonable measure, not enemies of Britain. The tension between those two realities is not something that historical consensus has resolved, and it may be precisely that irresolution, that refusal to let either side fully off the hook, that represents the most honest place the historical record can take us. The arguments of historians, however compelling or sophisticated, cannot entirely capture what it meant to be in that harbour on the afternoon of July 3rd, 1940. The strategic calculations, the archival disputes, the questions of proportionality and diplomatic process, all of that recedes when you try to imagine what was actually happening on the decks of those ships, among men who had spent years training alongside British sailors, who had shared the desperate weeks of the fall of France with British allies, and who now found themselves staring at British gun barrels across a stretch of North African water. The French sailors at Mers-el-Kébir were not abstracted units in a naval balance sheet. They were men who had, within the space of a few weeks, experienced one of the most disorienting sequences of events imaginable. They had fought in a war that their country lost with shocking speed. They had watched their nation negotiate an armistice that felt, to many of them, less like surrender than like survival, a desperate attempt to preserve something from the wreckage. They had received orders from a chain of command that still functioned, still wore French uniforms, still claimed legitimacy. And then, on an otherwise ordinary afternoon, the navy of their most recent ally opened fire on them. The concept of comradeship in arms carries a particular weight that peacetime language struggles to convey. Men who have served together, trained together, and faced common dangers develop bonds that cross national lines with surprising ease, bonds built on shared professional respect, on the mutual recognition of what it costs to be a sailor or a soldier, on the simple fact of having sat beside one another when things were dangerous. Many of the French officers at Mers-el-Kébir had attended joint exercises with the Royal Navy. Some had personal friendships with British counterparts. The transformation of those counterparts into attackers was not just strategically bewildering, it was, at a human level, a kind of violence against the meaning of what comradeship was supposed to mean. Admiral Gensel, commanding the French squadron, understood himself throughout the crisis to be acting with honour. He was a professional naval officer of long standing, and honour, in the culture of the French Navy, was not a vague sentiment, but a structured code, a set of obligations that defined what a man in his position was and was not permitted to do. When he refused the British terms, he was not simply being stubborn or nationalist. He was, in his own understanding, fulfilling the specific requirements of his position. He had received orders from a legitimate superior authority. He had given certain commitments about the fleet's disposition, and to abandon those commitments under British threat would have felt to him like a betrayal of everything his career had stood for. That the British were simultaneously interpreting his behaviour as delay, as evasion, as evidence that he could not be trusted, this was not simply a miscommunication. It was a collision between two men, each acting according to his own sense of honour, in a framework where those senses of honour were producing irreconcilable outcomes. Below the officers, the ordinary sailors had almost no agency at all. They knew something tense was happening. You can feel the weight of a standoff, even from the lower decks, but the details of the ultimatum, the precise terms being negotiated above them, the exact nature of the danger they were in, were largely invisible to them. They were obedient, as sailors are trained to be obedient. When the shells began falling, many were trapped below, in compartments that the armoured superstructure of capital ships transforms, under fire, into something close to sealed coffins. The Bretagne, which exploded and sank within minutes, took the majority of its crew with it. Those men died not because they had chosen war, not because they had threatened Britain, but because they were where they were, in a harbour, in a ship, wearing a uniform, at the wrong intersection of great power anxieties and political urgency. The emotional legacy of Mers-el-Kébir in France proved to be both deep and durable. Survivors carried a sense of betrayal that no subsequent diplomatic language could fully dissolve. Families of the dead absorbed a grief that was complicated by confusion. Their men had died not in battle against the enemy, but at the hands of an ally, in what was technically a time of armistice rather than active war. The French Navy, as an institution, nursed a particular bitterness that shaped its orientation for years. When, in 1942, the decision was made to scuttle the fleet at Toulon rather than allow it to fall to the Germans, some French officers would reflect that at least this time the fleet's fate was in French hands, a pointed comparison to the moment when that agency had been violently removed by the British at Mers-el-Kébir. In British memory, the emotional texture of the episode was handled differently, acknowledged but contained within the framework of necessity. Churchill wept in the House of Commons when he reported the attack, and that gesture was genuine in its way, an expression of the cost he understood the decision to carry. But the cultural processing of those deaths in Britain moved relatively quickly toward the strategic justification, and the French sailors themselves remained in British public consciousness somewhat peripheral figures in a story that was primarily about British resolve. The asymmetry in how the two nations carried the memory is itself revealing. For Britain, Mers-el-Kébir was one chapter in a story of survival. For France, it was a wound with its own distinct identity. What resists reduction to strategy is the particularity of each life that ended in that harbour. The 20-year-old sailor who had never been in combat before. The petty officer who had a family waiting in Toulon. The junior lieutenant who admired the Royal Navy and had hoped, even during the standoff, that some arrangement would be found. These were not abstractions, they were people caught at the point where historical forces intersect with individual existence, with no more power to alter the outcome than the ships they served on had to move themselves out of range. Strategy is how we think about these events from above. Tragedy is how they were experienced from within. The most honest accounting of Mers-el-Kébir insists on holding both registers simultaneously, acknowledging that the calculations made in London had their own internal logic, and that the men who died as a result of those calculations deserved more than to be subsumed entirely into the logic that killed them. History can offer analysis and context. What it cannot do is give those 1,300 men back to the world that lost them. So where does all of this leave us? After tracing the strategic panic in London, the collapsed negotiations in a North African harbour, the geopolitical signals sent to Washington and Berlin, the French fury, and the human cost borne by 1,300 men who never chose to be enemies of Britain, we arrive at the question that has haunted this event since the guns fell silent on July 3rd, 1940. Was it necessary? Was it a mistake? And is it possible, uncomfortably, that the honest answer is yes to both? The case for necessity has real weight. Britain in the summer of 1940 was not operating from a position of security or confidence. It was operating from something closer to controlled desperation. A nation that had just watched its primary ally collapse in 6 weeks, that had barely extracted its army from the beaches of Dunkirk, that faced a Germany at the absolute height of its power, and that had to reckon, every single day, with the genuine possibility that invasion was coming. In that context, the French fleet was not an abstraction. It was a collection of powerful warships that could, under certain circumstances, fundamentally alter the naval balance in waters Britain needed to control. Churchill and the War Cabinet were not inventing a threat for political theatre. They were making a calculation about what they could not afford to risk. And the calculation, in at least one dimension, worked. The message that Mers-el-Kébir sent to Roosevelt, to Hitler, to every government watching Britain's behaviour in those early weeks of standing alone, was unambiguous. This was a country that would do whatever it took. A country that would fire on a former ally, rather than accept an arrangement it didn't trust. That signal contributed to a broader impression of British resolve that mattered enormously for everything that followed. American support, continued resistance, the long argument that survival was possible. You cannot entirely separate the brutality of the act from the utility of the message it carried. But the case against it is also genuinely compelling, and it deserves more than dismissal as sentimentality. The French fleet, under the terms of the armistice, was not being handed to Germany. The Vichy government had commitments on paper, and as the eventual scuttling at Toulon would demonstrate, the French Navy harboured a deep institutional resistance to allowing its ships to fall into German hands. There is a real argument that the worst-case scenario Britain was trying to prevent was, in fact, unlikely, and that the diplomatic cost of proving that argument wrong was enormous. The attack on Mers-el-Kébir handed Vichy a propaganda weapon, inflamed French opinion against Britain for years, complicated the entire relationship with France for the duration of the war and beyond, and contributed to an atmosphere of Franco-British mistrust that took generations to fully soften. Those are not trivial consequences. What makes Mers-el-Kébir such an enduring case study is precisely that it refuses to flatten into a simple lesson. It is not a story about good decisions or bad decisions in the conventional sense. It is a story about what happens to democratic societies under conditions of extreme fear, about how the pressure of potential defeat can push governments toward choices that, in ordinary times, would be unthinkable, and about how the logic of survival can be simultaneously compelling and morally corrosive. Britain was not acting from cruelty or indifference. It was acting from fear and from a ruthless determination not to lose. Those are understandable human motivations. They do not automatically produce justifiable outcomes. There is also something worth sitting with in the particular form of the dilemma. Churchill and his cabinet were not choosing between a good option and a bad one. They were choosing between several bad options under conditions of radical uncertainty with incomplete information, against a clock in a world where the consequences of being wrong could be catastrophic. That is the structure of many of the worst decisions in wartime. Not a clear moral choice, deliberately corrupted, but a genuine trap where every exit carries its own form of damage. Understanding that structure doesn't dissolve the moral weight of the 1,300 dead. But it does explain why Mers-el-Kébir resists the kind of clean verdict that retrospective judgment often tries to impose. Perhaps the most honest thing history can say about this event is that Britain may well have saved itself at Mers-el-Kébir, and that saving itself required an act it should never be entirely comfortable having committed. That tension is not a flaw in our analysis. It is the point. The decision was made in a harbour in North Africa on an otherwise ordinary afternoon, and it was necessary, and a mistake, and a tragedy, and a signal, and a wound all at once. History does not always resolve its central questions. Sometimes it simply asks us to hold them without looking away.